Sam, how would you like to lead us in word of prayer this morning?
Lord, I want to thank you.
Okay. Believe it or not, we're still in Deuteronomy. Is that good, Kurt? Okay, just making sure I'm not too loud. I think I'm loud, but that's okay. Why, thank you, Bill. As long as we're in agreement. Okay, that's the point. Okay, we're in Deuteronomy 18. And again, we're not trying to cover the entire book. A lot of this is repetitious. We've actually gone over it in the book of Leviticus and the book of Numbers. And so there are parts of this that I'm just going to touch on and hopefully get to some of the meat that is distinct for this book. Moses is delivering this maybe sermon in the last days of his life. Israel, the new generation, is getting ready to enter Israel and carry on the conflict. Moses can't go in. And so he wants to make sure he has reminded this new generation, after the first generation has finally fully died off, of significant points in God's law, and so that they are fresh as they enter the land. The opening of chapter 18 deals with the priests and Levites, a reminder of what portion belongs to the priests. The reason it does, because they have no inheritance as far as the land is concerned, and the people's response is to support and provide for the tribe of Levi, who has been chosen by God to minister for the nation as a whole. You drop down to verse 9, and he starts talking about it. And again, back in Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, we talked about actually a pretty extensive, especially sexual list of sins and wickedness that mark these people that God is sending Israel to exterminate. Here he deals with another side of it. Look at verse 9 and following. He says, "When you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire." So a live burnt offering, it appears commonplace in these cultures. This was a very dangerous and in God's sight, disgusting practice. And so that's the one he lists first. But then he continues, or one who practices witchcraft, or a soothsayer, one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. For all who do these things are an abomination to the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord your God drives them out before you. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God. These nations which you dispossess listen to soothsayers and diviners. As for you, the Lord your God has not appointed such for you. So dealing with, we could say, the spiritual dark forces maybe is another good way to put that. But practicing these abomination rituals, abominable practices, God wants nothing of that type to be in the land. That's part of why the land is vomiting out its current inhabitants by executing them. Okay, we're going to keep going. Verse 15. Now this one you might recognize. Look up Acts 3:22. I need somebody to read that for me. Russ, how about it? Acts 3:22. Okay, and who was he talking about? Exactly, Jesus there in Acts chapter 3. And so this is a very significant passage, although the way it's written keep in mind it's written as also just a part of. As a matter of fact, if you watch how it flows, when you get down to verse 20, you'll go from this coming promised prophet to a false prophet, one that you don't need to worry about. And so the way Moses is delivering it, it's not one of these all in bold case letters specifically talking about Jesus and setting it apart as a distinct prophet. This is a part of a longer message. The prophet that God approves of, people were to hear. And ultimately, the final prophet is the one, of course, that we read about in Acts chapter 3. Verse 15, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren. Him you shall hear, according to all you desired of the Lord your God in Horeb, in the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, nor let me see this great fire any more, lest I die. And the Lord said to me, what they have spoken is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name. See how that just transitions straight over. He says, you're looking for this true prophet, the genuine prophet, but don't just take them at face value. Evaluate, listen, and watch. He says, the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. So we're talking about a very serious, very sober responsibility and practice. He says, if you say in your heart, how shall we know the word which the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the thing does not happen or come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken. Prophet has spoken it presumptuously, you shall not be afraid of him. Just out of curiosity, how did we know for sure Jesus is the true prophet? Using that same standard. Did he prophesy anything? Did he tell people what was going to happen? Oh, good one, Bill. I like that. But right here it says, you watch to see if it comes to pass, right? And Jesus says, we're going up to Jerusalem. I'll be delivered up to the high priests. I'll be put to death. And on the third day, I'll do what? Rise again. By that event, if nothing else, by that event, you have clear fulfillment of this whole section. The false prophet would make a promise that would not happen. The true prophet, it would come to pass. Why did the religious leaders have to put guards outside the tomb? Do you normally guard a cemetery plot? Why did they put guards? Huh? That's what they said. They were also worried that his words would come to pass, which they did, and then they go into damage control. Yes, sir?
This point in time in Jesus' ministry.
Depends on when you date the Exodus. Normally, it's most conservative would date it around 1400, in the 1400s BC. So here we're dealing with 1400 years before the time of Christ. Well, let's answer that question. At this point in history, Israel has yet to enter the promised land, right? So Joshua hasn't carried out the conquest. Those things haven't happened. After the time of Joshua, you've got the book of Judges, where you have God raising up judges at various points to deliver Israel. And then you've got the period of the kings and following. And during that time frame, especially after you get past Solomon, you have the rise of a regular, fairly continual set of what we refer to as the prophets, right? So they're going to have the entire prophet section is going to show up after this event. Realistically, they should have been listening and evaluating what the prophets were saying. And in a lot of cases, I'm sure at least some of the voices did. The people were consistently resistant against the voices of the prophets. So I would say that the people didn't want to really look for the genuine prophets. I mean, Isaiah, according to tradition, was sawn in half. Zechariah was taken from the very altar and put to death. You go back through the list, and all the prophets who should have been accepted, who should have been at least evaluated scripturally, evaluated according to God's standards, every one of those, we're going to assume by the religious leadership, was treated the same way. So that Jesus says, which of the prophets did your fathers not? Well, all of them? Yeah. So when Jesus comes on the scene, it shouldn't surprise us that the same religious leadership that has for over 1,300 years, let's use 12, because maybe during the time of Joshua we don't have particularly prophets, so let's use 1,200 years. But for 1,200 years, this same religious leadership tradition has consistently acted in the same fashion. They have resisted, they have ridiculed, at times they've imprisoned, and they put to death prophet after prophet after prophet. So when Jesus comes on the scene, we really shouldn't be expecting anything else. They had just set the tone, and it was, well, we use the word a train wreck. It was going to happen because that's not going to change. So did the people look for it? Some of them must have, because you do have responses of at least a portion of the population time and again. David responds, and Josiah responds, and Hezekiah responds. But as a general rule, no, they're consistent. And you're dealing with, 1,200 years at least of consistent rebellious behavior. So were the people looking for it? I'd say the people probably were, and gave audience, the religious leadership, who at the end of the day wound up with all the power. They did not. And so their will always seemed to have won out. Do I? Yeah, but did they really want to know? And he was Elijah, the spirit of Elijah, right? John the Baptist, neat thing about that, I was just thinking about that in my mind. All of the prophets, and John is portrayed as the greatest of the prophets, all of the rest of the prophets are killed by the religious opposition. Who kills John? Herod, the king. The religious opposition really didn't get to have the final hand in John, the ultimate prophet. It wound up being I'm going to say false king, who shouldn't have been a king because he wasn't Jew, he was Idumean. But anyway, so when he utters these words, the point I was trying to make was the original hearers of this statement about the new prophet may or may not have realized that he was talking about one ultimate prophet specifically. As in, was this necessarily the Messiah, or was it someone different? Because John would have, if he hadn't said he wasn't, John could have been identified as that based on what he was saying, what he prophesied, and what he spoke. They may or may not have understood this specifically as Messiah. At some point, it becomes evident that he's talking about an ultimate and final prophet. And that has to be. Go ahead. Okay. Right. Right.
whole picture is God is chasing.
Ooh, that's good.
He's like, yeah, okay, fine. They can't come close to me. I will keep reaching out to them and do it from one of their own.
And he does consistently. The folks who claim that the God of the Old Testament is just a God of wrath, they totally ignore that. Totally ignore that and overlook or refuse to see the fact that consistently he is he is pursuing, he is chasing, he is calling and beckoning. And in spite of their continued rebellion and refusal, God just doesn't give up. And eventually, he produces Jesus because he's managed to save a remnant. Not the bulk of the people because they just refused to be saved, but he managed to spare a remnant, and because he doesn't give up. Okay, other comments? Chapter 19. Here you're dealing with the cities of refuge. One of the reasons this is important, we read this and we think, okay, God is assigning Israel the responsibility once the lands are established to separate the land into roughly 3 zones and provide a city of refuge in each of those 3 zones so that certain individuals have access to them in order to save their lives. And sometimes you can read it and you get the impression, okay, this is basically a, what's the word I'm trying to come up with? This is one of those things where God is saying, you're going to do this just because I said so. Point back at yours. Don't lose sight of the fact that one of the reasons that the nations are being cast out of the land is because of the blood guilt that's in the land. And if you read through these instructions, and there's another in a chapter to come, in chapter 21, God is reminding them that the reason behind this is to protect the land, because the land is getting ready to be, well, wait a minute. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 9 just for a minute. Let me read this first before I make this statement. Genesis chapter 9, what has just happened. Started in chapter 6 and it's run all the way up to this point. What has just happened in this point? The flood, right? God has Noah build the ark. God spares Noah and his family. The flood happens. All living creatures not in the ark, all living land creatures, I should say, not in the ark, perish. And then God stops the rain. The water drains, and they're finally able to leave the ark. And chapter 9 opens with, it says, verse 1, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And the fear of you and the dread of you, verse 2, this is a new condition. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that move on the earth, and on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. Another new condition. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I've given you all things, even as the green herbs. So you've got 2 changes to creation that had never existed before by God's design. One, you've got the animal kingdom now being fearful of mankind. Nothing said of that before this point. And now you have meat added to the human diet, which it was not, according to God's design, before this time. Verse 4. He says, but you shall not eat flesh with its life. That is, it's what? It's blood. Surely for your lifeblood, human blood, I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it. So if a beast kills a person, God will require the beast's life. From the hand of man, from the hand of every man's brother, I will require the life of man. Verse 6, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. Now, that's a principle that's begun with Genesis chapter 9. God says he puts a special significance on the life, which is the blood, of human human beings. Now, in essence, that has always been in place because from the first crime, when Cain slays his brother Abel, Abel's blood cries out from the ground. But God is consistent in this. The shedding of innocent blood defiles that part of his creation, defiles the land, and as a result, defiles the culture. And so you could trace back the punishment of these 7 nations, at least in large part, to the fact that they filled the land with innocent blood. The blood guilt of the land was at least a major part of what leads to their being exterminated. And so God is now, he's saying, okay, when you go in and you wipe out these people, that's my wrath being executed. I'm demanding the blood guilt from the guilty nations, the guilty parties. After that point, the land will be cleansed and you're given a clean land. What matters is don't allow that to be defiled again. So you don't offer your children as burnt offerings. Why? Because that's innocent blood being shed. And you don't allow intentional murder to be unpunished, because that allows the land to be defiled by innocent blood. And so these 3 cities of refuge are a part of that discussion, because God makes a distinction between blood defilement and non-blood defilement. Both of them involve the end of human life, generally at the cause of another person, but with a clear distinction. Okay, let's look at the distinction. Let's see. Look at verse 4. Deuteronomy 19, verse 4. This is the case of the manslayer who flees there that he may live. Whoever kills his neighbor, what does your translation have there? Mine says unintentionally. I didn't know if there were other translations somebody else might put, some other translations might use. Kills his neighbor unintentionally, not having hated him in time past, as when a man goes to the woods with his neighbor to cut timber. His hand swings a stroke with the axe to cut down the tree. The head slips from the handle and strikes his neighbor so that he dies. He shall flee to one of these cities and live, lest the avenger of blood. Now that sounds pretty hostile to us. What did God say in Genesis 9 he expected to happen to the one who takes, and again, we're going to be talking about murder, intentional murder. What does God say he expects to happen to the one who intentionally takes another's life? Yes, by another person, right? Now, at this point, Israel does not have a large central government. She doesn't have all of the civil things in place. She doesn't have a king to enforce this. And so when it talks about the avenger of blood, that person actually has a duty, a responsibility before God to keep the land clean from blood defilement. So don't read this as, oh man, this was the Wild West back then. No, this is talking about a time where this was part of God's design to fulfill the very thing he had in place since Genesis 9. So when he talks about the avenger of blood, this is an individual who is doing what he's supposed to do. Whether it's I believe it's the same term. Doug, tell me if you've heard this. I think this is the same term translated here, avenger of blood, that's elsewhere translated kinsman redeemer. Isn't that right? Yeah, I think it's the same term, but the context is why they translate it differently. Seems like I read it somewhere, but I'm not a good Hebrew person, as you know, so. But I think that's the case. Okay, where'd I leave off? Verse 6. Lest the avenger of blood, while his anger is hot, pursue the manslayer and overtake him, because the way is long, and kill him, though he was not deserving of death, since he had not hated the victim in time past. God makes a distinction. And so our laws that make distinction between premeditated and capital murder and manslaughter, they're based on God's ancient principle. Both involve the taking of human life. When they cross the Jordan and go to Jericho, they're going to take a lot of human life. But doesn't fall under the heading of murder. And so in this case, he's making the distinction between manslayer or manslaughter and premeditated murder. And so he says, I want you to have 3 cities, and I want them to be in the various parts of the nation so that they can be reached by the one who is trying to flee because he does not deserve to die. And then he says, down in verse 8, he says, if the land expands, I want you to add 3 more so that the innocent person, not because he hasn't taken human life, but because he did not do it intentionally, so that he has the opportunity to be spared. Now, it doesn't say the manslayer has any responsibility, the avenger of blood has any responsibility not to take his life if he's not in the city of refuge. It's a conditional deliverance, okay? That person has to flee to the city, and there he's to remain safe. But he's not done yet. Verse 10, lest innocent blood be shed in the midst of your land, which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and thus guilt of bloodshed be upon you. Elsewhere it'll say be upon the land, or it'll be defiled by the shedding of innocent blood. Verse 11, the distinction, if anyone hates his neighbor, lies in wait for him, rises against him and strikes him mortally so that he dies, and he flees to one of these cities, then the elders of his city shall send and bring him from there and deliver him over to the hand of the avenger of blood, that he may die. Your eyes shall not pity him, but you shall put away the guilt of innocent blood from Israel. There we are back to that again, that it may go well with you. God says, here's 2 options. Manslaughter, it happens unintentionally. There was no malice involved. Those cities are available, and if the person goes to those cities, they're to be spared. They're to be protected from the one who would try and exact vengeance. If it is intentional, if it is murder that was done intentionally, even if they reach the city, the elders of his city are supposed to go get him and bring him back home. So that means those cities of refuge, they're to protect the one who killed accidentally, but they're to deliver the one who killed intentionally. God's putting a lot of responsibility on the elders and the people of the city, because all of this depends on everyone. Well, I hate to use the expression playing by the rules, because it's a very intense subject. But they're following the laws. They're following God's design. Okay? You've got the property boundaries in this one verse. It's the reason this matters so much is because God will be giving each tribe their inheritance, and that is to be theirs in perpetuity. And so by moving the boundaries, you are stealing from your brother, and you are disobeying and rebelling against God and his standards. So that, again, that's just one verse in between murder and false witness. Some of these, I wonder why he throws those in there. I think they're rabbits, Russ. That's what I think's going on there. Look at verse 15. One witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin that he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, the matter shall be established. If a false witness rises against any person or man to testify against him of wrongdoing, then both men in the controversy shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who serve in those days. The judges shall make careful inquiry. And indeed, if the witness is a false witness, who has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he thought to have done to his brother. So you shall put away the evil among you. Again, you're not going to defile the land. He says, those who remain shall hear and fear. So it's supposed to be a deterrent. And hereafter they shall not again commit such evil among you. God is truly against false accusations and false witness. Verse 21, your eye shall not pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Lex talionis. And the false accuser, the one who brings a trumped-up charge or a charge that has no merit, maybe they're trying to cause problems or trying to whatever, they're to pay the same penalty that they wanted exacted from the other. I guess it's still a phrase. When we lived in the valley, 25 years ago, the valley had this, Rio Grande Valley I'm talking about, had this distinction either in the state or the nation. And I'm trying to remember. But at one point, I think it was national, they were considered the lawsuit abuse capital. I think it was of the country. I know it was of the state, but I think it was considered the lawsuit abuse capital of the country because there were so many faulty lawsuits being brought just for any and every kind of, all they had to do was have somebody make an accusation and they would go to trial and they would sue. And let me give you an illustration. We got time. One of my elders was down there, was also the chief of police for a time. His wife ran the nursing program at the local hospital. So they were, high-standing people in the community, really wonderful people. Well, Sally was driving through a neighborhood, and she was driving the speed limit, doing everything legally. She did not have a stop sign. The road coming in from this way had a stop sign. And she's driving, and this child on a bicycle shoots through that stop sign and runs into the side of her car. Okay. And they go down. Sally stops, and she's a nurse. She makes sure everything's okay, and he wasn't really hurt with anything serious, just bumps and bruises. And sent them on their way and thought everything was okay until they get served with a subpoena. Because the parents of the child who ran into her car sued Sally on behalf of this child's brother, who was behind him following on another bicycle for emotional trauma. And guess what State Farm did? They paid it in a heartbeat. Because they said, you put that child on a stand and the jury will give them anything they want. There was no merit, no damage, and she was in the right. And yet that was a normal way of life until they finally passed some lawsuit reforms in the state. But it was primarily because of what was going on in the Rio Grande Valley. This would prevent that. Because if you sued McDonald's for $1 million because you burned yourself with a cup of coffee, and you were found not accurate, guess what you'd owe? $1 million to McDonald's. I think that would be a wonderful deterrent. Just shows you how old I am. I know. Okay, chapter 20. And again, we're taking the high road across this because I'd like to get to 21 if we can. Chapter 20 is making a distinction. God is giving regulations and directions for what happens after the conquest when Israel goes to war against another enemy. It is not addressing what happens to the nations in the land because he tells them that. Verse 16, he says, of the cities of these peoples, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall let nothing that breathes remain alive. And so verses 1 through 15 and the others that don't address these specific 7 nations, those are all talking about, let's see. Well, for instance, he says, if you go up against a city to wage war, you make an offer of peace. Well, they tried to be peaceful with King Sihon of Og just back in Numbers. They tried to make peace, and he refused. He came out to wage war against them, and they defeated his army. That was to be Israel's means of waging war in the future, after the conquest of the land. So there's hostility, there's an enemy, maybe they're sending in raiding parties. The Syrians will do this for generations after this time period, and other peoples, the Philistines, will as well. Those don't fall under this ban, or korban, as some people use it. He says, here's how you're going to wage war in this regard. You're going to do it with restrictions. You're going to do it with limitations. You're going to do it according to my principles. Even to the point of, verse 19, if you lay siege to a city and you go to build siege works, he says you cannot cut down and use any trees that bear fruit or bear food for you. You could only cut down the scrub trees, the trees that were not fruit-bearing trees. And so God puts some really pretty strong restrictions on this and says, I expect you to wage war within these guidelines. Here are my determining factors. In the future, we don't know whether the kings as a whole did that. We can assume the good kings did probably, but the wicked kings, there's no details along those lines. But again, he is regulating these. This is speaking to their future beyond the conquest. Okay, 21. I wanted to get to this chapter because I really like it. Here's the setup. Somebody's out walking, taking a trip, or surveying a piece of land, maybe to purchase or to plant or whatever, and they come across a corpse. Don't know how the corpse got there. They don't have CSI to deal with the issues and find the DNA and all that stuff. So what do you do with that corpse? If it's allowed to remain there, and that's innocent blood, then again you've got blood defiling the land. So judges were supposed to go out, or elders were supposed to go out and go to the corpse and then measure the distance to the nearest settlements, the nearest cities or villages. And whatever village is closest, you're going to basically hold accountable. Their responsibility, then, you go to this, let's say from here it's Venus. Anybody from Venus? I'm not trying to offend anybody, but okay, yeah, you're right, Judith. But you'll bear with me, right? Okay. Venus is the closest. We found this body, and Venus is the closest. And so the judges who find the body and determine the distance go to the city and say, this city, as of this moment, bears the guilt of this blood. What are you going to do about it? The elders of the city, if they genuinely do not know anything about how that body got there, if they haven't heard any rumors, they haven't seen anybody posting on Facebook, any of that nonsense, and they can honestly say, we have no knowledge of this, and as far as we know, none of our people were involved in this, then they were to take a heifer, take it out to running water, it refers to it as living water, and break its neck before the judges. And then they were supposed to wash their hands over the body of the heifer and declare their innocence. And then, let's see. Here's what they're to say. Verse 7, Deuteronomy 21. They shall answer and say, our hands have not shed this blood, nor have our eyes seen it. Provide atonement, O Lord, for your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, and do not lay innocent blood to the charge of your people Israel. An atonement shall be provided on their behalf for the blood. So you shall put away the guilt of innocent blood. There we go again. Guilt in the people and guilt in the land. So you shall put away the guilt of innocent blood from among you when you do what is right in the sight of the Lord. I mean, he makes some really wonderful provisions to cover a whole laundry list of different situations. But he expects them to do it his way. You don't find the corpse and say, well, I don't know who did that. I guess we'll go bury it. And, nope. You've got to deal with the guilt of that blood, which is presumed to be innocent because they've been murdered. That's the presumption. And you have to deal with it your way. Okay, let's see. How much time we got? Ron has not corrected that clock yet. Let's just, well, Yeah, one of these we really have to look at. You've got female captives. This again has to do with your when you go into battle against other nations, not the 7 nations that they're supposed to exterminate, but after that and outside of that, you've got the option of taking a female captive as wife. It was part of the spoils of war. You've got firstborn inheritance wives rights, and it's almost as if Moses is specifically addressing Jacob in his situation with loved wife and unloved wife, and only in this case, the unloved wife is the one who has the firstborn son, and it gets twice as much of his inheritance. Yes, sir. That's what I said. In the seven nations they're supposed to exterminate, kill everybody. This is after that. The same way he regulated warfare outside of the 7 nations. Yeah, he says, no, this doesn't apply here. You take them all out, and no options. But then when you engage in other battles with other nations for whatever reason, here's the rule. And again, this is raising the standards of protection and provision for a female captive taken in war, because there weren't any restrictions or regulations normally. God is raising the standards. He says you'll treat them right, treat them with respect, but yes, at the end of the day, everything fulfilled, you can take them as wife. She doesn't have a choice in that, so it's still not 21st century standards, but it is head and shoulders above the norm for warfare in their day. Verse 18. Anybody ever quoted this passage to a rebellious teenage son? Just out of curiosity. Okay, good. One of us will admit it. I'm taking the 5th, but read this. This has so many different applications here. So many different points of meaning. No, I'm not saying it right. It speaks in so many, well, fiddle. Let's just read it. Deuteronomy 21, verse 18. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him, bring him out to the elders of his city, to the gate of his city. They shall say to the elders of his city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall put away the evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. You've got deterrent. What does that encourage the parents to do all the way through the upbringing of that child? Do it right? Practice discipline. Deal with them while they're still moldable. And if you don't, or if they, in spite of all of that, turn out to be exactly opposite of what God desires out of his people, you don't then say, well, that's all I can do, and turn them loose on society. You still have a responsibility. Again, I do not know, I cannot remember an instance where I saw this carried out in the story, but had it been done so, and done so faithfully and justly, it would have served as a deterrent, and it would have, okay, how am I going to word this? Raised the moral standards of their nation. For instance, is Samson a compliant and obedient and honoring son? Everybody shake your head this way. Come on. Samson. No, not even close. He's rebellious. He demands things from his parents. He's got a hot temper. He is messing around with the wrong women. according to the law, when he reached that point where they said we can't do anything else with him, what should have happened to Samson? He should have been put down, stoned. Had he done so, that rebellious lifestyle would have been prevented. Now, I know Samson, God uses him. Yes, I understand the rest of the story, but realistically, Samson fit this criteria pretty well. They didn't heed. Let's see. That was the first spell or second? Okay, we got to stop there. We're going to have to pick up the last few verses of this chapter next week, but I can't do it in 30 seconds.